Hey, everybody. Thanks for having me in. I'm Jeff Urbin at the FDR Library, and I'm delighted to be with you. I've only been to Maine ever once, and it was awesome. So I hope to get back up there again sometime. And thank you for taking the time to tune in and watch what we're doing here tonight. So I work at the Roosevelt Presidential Library. It's the nation's very first presidential library, the only one that was ever used by a president while they were actually president. FDR returned to Hyde Park over 200 times as president of the United States and used an office that he had there in the presidential library all throughout his third term and throughout the 83 days of his fourth term. And in our collection, we have 17.5 million pages of documents. That would be a stack 16 times as tall as the Washington Monument if you stacked them all on top of each other. We have about 50,000 books in our collection. 23,000 of those were President Roosevelt's books, and we have about 35,000 museum objects. So the information I'm giving you tonight, I'm sharing with you tonight, comes from that archive, comes from that collection, and I'm delighted to be here. So tonight we're going to talk about I love I love all history, but what I really love is when you can get into like little pockets of history, little things that most folks haven't heard about, or, most folks aren't that aware of. And that's what we're going to do tonight. We're going to talk about a little group of librarians called the Packhorse Librarians. But before we do that, I want to, and what we'll do is at the end, we'll open it up to questions and answers. So if you're afraid you're going to forget your question, you can just type it into the chat, and then we'll get to all those at the end. But before we get into discussion of our topic, I want to lay the context and the framework for from which this whole thing kind of came from. And that, of course, is the Great Depression. And the Great Depression was an unprecedented time of hardship here in the United States and also around the world. People tend to forget that it was a world global economic crisis, not just here in the US. And we averaged about 25% unemployment here in this country. Another 25% of folks could only find part-time jobs, and these are averages, so the numbers were higher in some places than in others. So 25% unemployment, 25% underemployment, farm failures at the rate of about 1,000 a day at the peak, bank failures at about that same rate, 1,000 a day at the peak, factory closures, people losing their homes. It was a tough time. And one of the hardest hit areas of the country was the area of Appalachia. Now, some people call it Appalachia. I'll let you decide, what you want to call it with that. And this was an area of dirt farmers and coal miners. So those were the big industries in those areas. And throughout Appalachia, there was about a 40% unemployment rate. So it was even higher than the national average. And many of these folks had been barely making it even before the Great Depression hit. And now with the impact of the Great Depression on top of that, they were really, really having a hard time. Now, Roosevelt's New Deal programs promised relief, and they were promised relief in the form of jobs. And that's really important because the idea of the jobs, of course, was to create paychecks, right? So, you get a job, you get a paycheck, now you go out, you spend that paycheck, that stimulates the economy, it generates demand, and the economy begins to get better. But even more important than that was the idea that a job gives you a purpose, right? When people lose their job, they lose an important part of their identity, right? I'm a teacher, you're a banker, you're a fireman, you're a police officer. And if you lose that job, you lose an important part of what helps to define who you are. And that was one of the big problems during the Great Depression. People lost their jobs and they lost a definition of who they were. They lost a focus. And that was something that really hit home because people lost hope. And if you've lost hope, you've lost pretty much everything, right? Because now you don't have any opportunity or any expectation that things are going to get better. So Roosevelt wanted to create job programs, and he created a series of them. There was the Tennessee Valley Authority, there was the Civilian Conservation Corps, and one of the most famous was the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. And it was known for its widespread building of big-time projects, right? big sorts of things. From where they worked from coast to coast, and they built roads, they built sidewalks, they built waterways, they built hospitals, they built schools, parks, airports, seaports, you name it, they built it. In fact, interestingly enough, right, the president just signed the infrastructure bill earlier this week. The infrastructure that that bill is going to correct and sort of rebuild and repair is the infrastructure that was built during the Great Depression. 50% of the American infrastructure was built during the Great Depression. And a large part of it was built by the WPA. So they had, big time projects like, here's an electric waterworks project, right? So first, you build the dam and then you run the water through and you generate the electricity. And think about the number of jobs you need to have in order to do this. You've got to have surveyors, you got to have carpenters, electricians, heavy equipment workers, you got to have people making cement, you got to have bookkeepers, all these sorts of things. So any one particular project created many, many more jobs along with that. And as I said, these were big time projects. This is, I think, a great example of one. This was a water system that was being built. And when I say big time, I mean it, right? Look at that truck. That's a car right there, actually a truck. And here's a guy standing next to it just for some perspective. And you could probably put 4 or 5 more of those cars on top of each other. Giant dams, here's FDR standing at a dam. He's inspecting it. What's interesting about this is you'll notice he's leaning on his cane, right? He was unable to stand unassisted. So whenever he stood, he was usually on the arm of a military officer, and then he would support himself with his cane in the other way. But he's inspecting this big WPA project there as well. And they also did some smaller projects. So whether you had these giant projects going on, sometimes you had people who didn't have construction skills, right, who couldn't do that kind of work. But there was other people employed as well. So if you were, let's say, an artist, you might be able to be hired to paint murals inside of post offices. So now, you are getting a job, you're getting a paycheck, you're having a purpose, and this post office is getting a beautiful mural up here as well. Now, one of the really important aspects of all of these projects is that Franklin Roosevelt wanted you to know that you had that job and you had that purpose because of him. And this came in really handy on election day, right? So suddenly if you had no job and now all of a sudden you do have a job, you have Franklin Roosevelt to thank for that, President of the United States. And the hidden message here is, let's keep him as President of the United States. So that was, you'd always find a big sign, going along with these projects as well. So that's what the WPA did in the big picture. But there was a little known segment of the WPA, a little corner pocket, as I said earlier, that doesn't get a whole lot of glory, doesn't get a whole lot of mention. But we're going to talk about them tonight. And they were, in fact, the Packhorse Librarians. Now, during this pandemic, I've been reading a lot of the great classics, primarily the Disney classics. And one of the things that Cinderella has taught us, if nothing else, that you have to have the appropriate footwear for the job. And the folks we're going to talk about tonight had this as their footwear, whether it was a horseshoe or a good old-fashioned, well-heeled, nice leather boot. This is what these folks were using out there on the trails as they were going through. Now, the Packhorse Librarians was a group of nearly 1,000 women over the course of the program. And what they did was they delivered books and Bibles and other reading materials to folks out in the hinterland. It's estimated that about 1.5 million people living primarily in the southeastern part of Kentucky between 1935 and 1943. This is where these Packhorse Librarians were the most active. So the southeastern portion of Kentucky from 1935 to 1943, and they serviced about 1.5 million people in that area over the course of that time. Now, the idea for the project and the program can be traced back to Paintsville, Kentucky, back in 1913. And there was a woman by the name of Mary Stafford, and she loved to read. She loved literature. She just loved books, and she thought everyone should have access to books. And so what she did was she talked to one of the local businessmen, a wealthy coal baron in that area, a guy by the name of John C.C. Mayo. And she said, if I had some funding, I could, build a better library, and we could get these books out to people rather than having to have people come in. We can get the books out. And Mr. Mayo said, wow, that's a great idea. I will fund you for that project. And he did. And it was a very successful project for about a year. Then after that year, Mr. Mayo died, and he left no provision in his estate to continue the funding for the program. So the program died out. Now it's estimated that from the American Library Association in 1936, that one out of every 3 people lost access to books during the Great Depression because libraries and schools began to go under as a result of the economic depression. So the Paintsville plan had been short-lived, but it had been very successful. And what happened was a woman by the name of Elizabeth Fullerton of Leslie County, Kentucky, remembered this program back in 1913, 1914. And when the Great Depression came along, she thought, well, gee, maybe this would be a good way. Maybe we should resurrect this idea. Maybe we should do this. But where are we going to get the funding? So she began to advocate for this. And she wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, and Eleanor Roosevelt thought it would be a great idea. And so what happened was they began to advocate and began to, sort of push for this program to be funded somehow. Now, at this time, the WPA, the Works Progress Administration, it was building all those dams and schools and hospitals and those sorts of things. They were looking for a way to hire more women. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, a champion of women, thought this would be a great opportunity because most of the time, if women were employed in the WPA, it was as bookkeepers or secretaries, those sorts of things. But they wanted to find a way to employ more women. And so what happened was Eleanor Roosevelt backed this idea, and they ended up passing a public law, Senate 1517, which allowed for the Packhorse librarians to become part of the WPA. So they were passed into legislation. Now, as always with these things, right, it's a little more complicated than it seems. Now, these women were sometimes called the book women. Sometimes they were called book ladies, Packhorse librarians. That's the one I like to use. And these were women, many of whom were the only workers in their families, and they were the only ones really bringing in a paycheck at that time. And the way that the public law was structured was that these women and the program would be funded only for their salaries. Only for the salaries. And these women would get about $28 a month, so a little bit less than $1 a day, and only for their salaries. So anything else that any other kind of expense had to be drummed up from someplace else. So the books, the horses, the materials, the supplies, all that stuff was unfunded, only the salaries for the women. And these women would sometimes travel 18 or 20 miles in the course of a day, going out there on the routes and delivering these books. These were tough women, generally in the ages of 25 to 35, and they were local women. They were women from the southeastern portion of Kentucky. And this was important for 2 reasons. Number one is they knew the land. Right? These women had grown up there. They knew the territory. They knew, where folks were. They knew how to get to folks, and they knew the lay of the land. The other reason it was important that they were local women is because many of the folks who lived up in the hinterland didn't take too kindly to outsiders. And they called people from the outside generally flatlanders, right? Not the mountain folks, but flatlanders. So these women who were, basically from the general area were able to sort of, go up to these houses and, the farmer would come out. Who are you? What do you want? Oh, hi, I'm, Sally Jenkins. You may have done some work with my uncle. He runs the sawmill in town, Jenkins Mill, and I'm here to, deliver. Oh, you're one of the Jenkins. Come on in, right? So they had these local connections, and that allowed them to make the contact with the people. So imagine you're making less than $1 a day, on average, $28 a month, and you're out there going to 18 or 20 miles a day, delivering these books all over the place. Now, what do these women look like? Well, here is a picture of a group of Packhorse librarians, and forgive my lack of super technology, but this works just as good. Here is a group of these Packhorse librarians, and what they're doing is they are going up a low stream bed. So this is the way they would get to these places. They would go up dry riverbeds or low stream beds. They would go along animal paths. They would go along the edges of farm roads and things, edges of farm fields. So here you have 4 women who are working their way up this low stream bed. And at some point along the way, they're going to break off into their own various routes that they're going to move off through. So they didn't generally travel, 3 or 4. They were lone women out there. But in the first part coming out of town, they would ride together and they would begin to move things up that way. A little closer look at a Packhorse librarian would look like this. So here is a young woman from that area, the southeastern part of Kentucky, and she has got her books here, and some of them are in a pouch, some of them she's holding here in her hand. Now, what is she doing? She's traveling along an area here, a pathway between a farm field and the forest. So where the farmer, left some territory so you wouldn't get, shade on your crops and stuff. But it wasn't, really well plowed. It was just kind of like a dirt road sort of thing. That's what these women would go on. Now, what's interesting about this picture is the pictures that I'm showing you of these Packhorse librarians are a little bit, I wouldn't say doctored, but they're not quite what these women really look like. And that the reason for that is this. There was a government program during the Great Depression called the FSA, the Farm Security Administration. And the FSA, their job was they were given cameras, and they were told they had like what they called shoot scripts. So they were given cameras and a list of things to take pictures of. And they were told to go out and take pictures of these things out there that are on this list. And the idea was to get a photographic baseline of how bad things were in the country. Then the New Deal programs would come in, make everything better, and then they would go back around and take pictures of the same things in much better shape and much better condition. And these women, not women, some were women, some of them were men, but these photographers took about 80,000 photographs during the Great Depression. I would be willing to bet every picture you've ever seen from the Great Depression was taken by someone from the FSA. And one of the most famous photographers of this program, Dorothea Lange. Okay, so what happened with these Packhorse librarians were they ended up on a shoot script. Oh, go out and take pictures of the Packhorse librarians. So they sent a cable out and they said, hey, Packhorse librarians, we're going to be there next Tuesday to take pictures of you as part of this FSA program. Well, these women didn't want to look, just like they were country folks and such. So they spiffed themselves up. So you probably wouldn't really go out there on, being a Packhorse librarian in shoes that look like this, walking along a path that look like this. So they gussied up. She's got her nice blazer on here. She's got her fancy shoes, and she's all ready to look, nice for the photograph. Here is another picture of a Packhorse librarian, and she is on a horse. And again, she's all gussied up. She's got her nice collared shirt on here. She's got her little cap. The horse has been all taken care of. He looks all nice and neat and everything. And they took the picture, and here is what a Packhorse librarian looks like on the horse. Now, some of them used horses, some of them walked. depending upon their preference and depending upon how they wanted to spend their money. So we'll get back to that picture in a minute. So they were being paid to do this, but they had to come up with the resources. So there were book drives held to collect books for the program. And they would collect books and magazines and Bibles and pamphlets and journals and periodicals. These were all collected and they were processed at what they called a monthly conference. So each month they would have a conference there in the little village, and they'd say, okay, everybody, on next Thursday, we're going to have the conference. So everybody bring any materials that you have to the conference. And this conference would meet in the church basement, or maybe the back room at the general store, or maybe somebody had a big dining room or something. And all these books would be brought there and they would be processed. And it kind of became sort of a social event, really. And people would drop off their books, and then the books would be cataloged and they would be inspected, and then they would be used to go out on these routes. Now, just to give you an idea, when I say catalog, I'm not talking about a computer. I'm not even talking about a card catalog like, you and I would remember. Kids today don't know what that is, but like you and I would remember. Many times the records were kept in nothing more than an old cheese box. So you have a cheese box and you've got slips of paper. You write down the books, you write down the conditions, you write down the routes that they're on, you put them in your file here, and this is how you kept track of this. There was no money for this sort of thing. So you made do with what you could, you made do with what you had. Now, one of the important things that always went out with these books were bookmarks. Bookmarks were really, really important. And the bookmarks, as you can see here, were made out of old seed catalogs up here, or greeting cards, sometimes out of scrap pieces of wallpaper and such. And so at the monthly conference, there'd be a portion of the table where the women, sometimes they would bring their children, then children would help as well, and they would be making bookmarks. And every book that went out with a bookmark. And the reason for this was because they wanted to keep the books in good shape. And they knew, like, how some people, when they read books, they dog ear the corner, right? They bend the corner over. And then, if you do that, that hurts the book. And the more you do that, the more the book gets hurt. Or sometimes people will take a book and they'll open it up like that and they'll just lay it down. And that's not good for the spine. These women cherished these books, right? These books were prized possessions. And so they really needed to take care of them. And so they went out with these bookmarks so that people wouldn't dog ear it. Now, I have a big pet peeve about people that dog ear books. And my sister is a huge dog earer of books, but she's also into origami. So when you lend my sister a book, it comes back looking like this, right? She not only bends the corners of the thing, but she does it in all these fancy decorative ways. Try putting that back on the shelf. It's not easy, let me tell you. So the bookmarks were really important because they extended the life of the books. The clerks at the conference would use scrap paper, as I said, empty cheese boxes, whatever they could find, and they would try to purchase paste and tape to repair the books. Sometimes the women would, sort of chip in to do that, so that they could fix the books, so they could go out on the routes and such. And when a book was finally no good, when it had finally used up its life on the trail, any parts of it that were good were cut up and they were turned into scrapbooks. They were turned into scrapbooks. So, okay, maybe most of the book is no good, but maybe there's a couple of pictures in there. We'll cut the pictures out. We'll paste those into a scrapbook. And now the scrapbook will go out and those pictures will have more life. So let's go back to our friend here, the Packhorse librarian. And these horses, by the way, that these Packhorse librarians would use, they would rent these for 50 cents a week. So the local farmers, of course, they weren't really farming anything because there was no markets to sell stuff. So the horses were just kind of standing around not doing anything. So these women said, all right, here's what I'll do. I will go and I'll rent your horse for 50 cents a week. And now the horse has got a job, right? So he's going to be fed, he's going to be, walked around, he's going to be taken care of. The farmer's getting 50 cents rent a month, or a week rather, which comes out to $2 a month. That's pretty big money for these guys. And, it's a small fraction of the monthly pay of what these women are working for here. So here is one of the packs. And a lot of times these packs were nothing more than a seed sack or a pillowcase. Now, wouldn't it be cool if you could take that pack and take a look at that and see what this woman has in that pack? Wouldn't that be kind of fun to do that? Well, through the miracle of modern reproductive artifacts, we could do that. I happen to have a pack identical to that right here. So let's take a look at the kinds of things you'd find in a Packhorse Librarians pack. What are you going to find in there? Well, the first thing you're going to find is Bible, the Bible. Bibles were a huge, huge resource on the trail. In fact, they were one of the most, if not the most, circulated books throughout these routes. And this was for a couple of reasons. Number one, you're talking about the Bible Belt, right? Appalachia, southeastern Kentucky. So you're in the Bible Belt. Very important, that these folks would have access to Bibles. They also could use the Bibles for Sunday school, lessons and things around the farm and there in their community. So it gave them ideas for that. And you also have to remember that a lot of these folks were not that well educated. And so everyone was familiar with the stories from the Bible. So even if you couldn't read so well, you probably could make out some of the words, Jesus, God, heaven, that sort of thing. And you would then be able to sort of follow along through the story because you heard it, you knew it so well, having heard it through oral history of going to church. And now you were able to sort of put two and two together. So Bibles were really, really important out there on the trail. The other things that were very popular were children's books, books for children. And these kinds of things like here we have, what is this, Treasure Island. Okay, and the children's books were really important on the trail because, again, two reasons. Number one is children's books tended to have larger print. So again, most of the folks you're servicing out there, they don't have access to a lot of good medical care, right? They don't necessarily have glasses if they need them. So by giving them books with larger print, it helped them be able to read those books. Also, the words in these books tended to be a little more simplistic. You weren't going to find big, fancy words. And so if you weren't a strong reader, you would still be able to use the book because, most of the words were simple, the print was big, and you probably could figure it out from there. Also, a lot of times these books had illustrations. So you could sort of follow along to the story to see just by looking through the illustrations. So you also have things like Robin Hood, very popular, right? The idea of a guy robbing the rich and giving the money to the poor, right? Very important concept, especially during the Great Depression. Things like Hansel and Gretel, right? Everybody knows the story. Well, now I can read along with it, and again, even if I'm not that strong with the words, I know the story, so I can follow along with the pictures and also with the words. And A Spy in Williamsburg, again, it's kind of a fun book, sort of a way to keep your mind off your troubles, right? You're out there on the farm, you're not selling anything, you're not really growing anything, things aren't going so good. So guess what? I can use this to sort of pass the time. I'll look for the Packhorse Librarian to come through. I'll get some books from her, and then that'll give me something to do over the next couple of weeks. But it wasn't just books; it was also periodicals. So here, one of the popular ones, National Geographic. And National Geographic was a good one to send around because the articles that tended to be in National Geographic tended not to go out of style or out of timeliness. So for example, this one has in here about the migration of hummingbirds. Well, hummingbirds do that every year, right? So this book, this catalog, this magazine could go out on the route once a year around the time that these guys do their migration, and that story would suddenly be new again, right? It would make sense. So those kinds of stories that didn't go out of style. Folks also like to get a sense of how the other half was living, how other folks. So fancy magazines like Redbook, if these were donated, these were sent out, and the young women on the farm could see how the fancy women were living in the cities and such, and kind of lived their life through that, kind of like we do with the Kardashians and those sorts of things today. And then, of course, Pa and Grandpa, you can go out here and look at American Magazine and you can get a sense of how the big time golfers are doing. Now, probably Grandpa and Pa are not going to, be big golfers out there in Appalachia, but still, it's kind of fun to see how other people do things and the kinds of things that other people do. Also, on the trails going out there would be books that were useful. Like this was a book about kerosene lamps. So this was a book that would help you to learn how to keep your kerosene lamp clean, how to repair it, where to look for parts, kinds of things you could substitute for parts and such. And, it was a great opportunity to share information and get ideas out that way there as well. Once the books were no longer useful, right? If they had been beat up or, rushed around or, just, dog-eared to the point where they couldn't be used anymore, that's when the scrapbooks came in. And so what the folks would do with the monthly conferences, they would look through the books. If they were deemed, not qualified to go back out on the trail, they would cut them up and they would make scrapbooks. So here's Harlan County Packhorse Library. And this is Works Progress Administration, London, Kentucky, District number 4. And so you open this up, and what is it? It's a scrapbook, just like we said, right? So there's recipes and things cut out here from the magazines and the books. Here's some pictures of fancy, dressed women and such. Here are some patterns for how to make dresses and aprons and things. Here's a magazine article, Josephine, Woman of Fortune, which you can see was no longer, in good shape. And so cut out, made into the scrapbook. So it has a new life as it goes out there. Also, they would like to have big, colorful pictures like this. Because again, if you couldn't read so well, Granny could sit you down and she could look at this and she could make up a story about this for the younger kids that were sitting around, the campfire or the house fire there, the fireplace. So even if Granny couldn't read so well or didn't have access to, big words and such, she could make up a story based upon the pictures. And that was just as entertaining and used a thing that nobody, under, these kids these days, they don't use their imaginations the way, some of them should, and the way these kids did back in the day. And then there were also pictures included from WPA projects like the Federal One project, where it was, they did theater programs and such. So they hired actors and actresses and they would put those things in there. Sometimes people would draw pictures in the margins and things. One of the things that was really popular, and I want to share this with you, one of my favorites, recipes. Now, you guys have probably, it's after dinner time, so you've had your meal for the day, your big meal for the day. But keep this in mind for tomorrow. And I'm going to share with you 2 recipes. One is for baked opossum. And here's how you do that. First, you dress the opossum and stew until tender. Then place small twigs or limbs of spicewood in a pan with the opossum, and you do that to flavor. Add pepper, lard, and salt, and bake. Sounds good, doesn't it? Your mouth's watering, isn't it? Well, now maybe baked opossum is a little heavy for some people. So you might want to go with this next recipe for baked groundhog. And what you do with that is you parboil until tender. And then you get some of that spicewood switches and you lay it underneath and on top, and you place it in the oven and you bake. And I'm not kidding you. These are real live recipes, that were passed around out there in this part of the country. Very popular to have that sort of stuff out there. Oh, and then another big thing that was popular was quilting. So stories about quilting and patterns and those sorts of things would be passed around with this sort of stuff as well. So these are the kinds of things that these ladies would carry around in their packs. And the routes were laid out, as I said, mostly along dried riverbeds or animal paths, or along the edges of farm fields and such. Now, the books were carried in old suitcases. They were carried in crates. They were carried in sack bags. They were carried in pillowcases. Whatever the women had, they would make do with. Now, sometimes what they would do to raise money, because they needed to buy tape and paste and those sorts of things for the monthly conferences, sometimes what they would do is they would have penny drives. And while they were there at the house, they would say, "Oh, if you guys have any extra pennies, which a lot of people didn't have, but if you did happen to have some, we could really use those to buy paste and tape and glue and that sort of stuff." And so they began to raise money that way. And some of the PTAs, the Parent Teacher Associations, got involved with that as well, and they organized penny drives, and they also helped to collect books and supplies for the Packhorse librarians. See, many of the schools had shut down in this area because there was no money to pay the teachers. So the PTA had nothing to do, so they got involved with this and they began to work with this program as well. And what they did was they opened up the school books to be used by the Packhorse librarians as well. So if the schools had libraries, or if the schools had, textbooks and such, these were used to go out on the trails as well. Now, when you're talking about raising money in pennies, we're not talking about big time money at this time. One penny drive raised $52. But if you think about that in terms of being raised, pennies at a time, that's a pretty big penny drive. But $52 is not a lot of money. In Lee County, they had a pie sale, and the pie sale raised $18.50. In Jackson County, Kentucky, they put someone wrote a play, and they put on a play, and they raised money by showing the play. And the play was called Go Slow Mary, and it was based upon a Packhorse librarian named Mary, who had come into town a little bit too quick, and her bag, her parcel of books bounced off the horse and landed there in the roadway. And of course, that's a no-no, right? We want to keep these books as in good shape as possible. And so she was going too quick, and they wrote a little play about it, and they put on the play, and she kind of became a local, celebrity and such. And they were able to raise $17.25 through that play. So this was an opportunity for folks really to get involved and to work through this. Periodically, there'd be a newspaper or magazine article about the Packhorse librarians that would be syndicated, and that happened in the end of November of 1936. So in the end of 1936, and by March of 1937, that one syndicated newspaper article was responsible for bringing in 2,351 books and over 11,000 magazines from 18 states. People were sending this stuff in so that they could use it through this program. It took at least 10,000 items, whether they were books or Bibles or scrapbooks or magazines or pamphlets, to operate a successful route. And by 1937, they estimate that there were about 60,000 books in circulation in that area. 155 public schools were participating in this, by donating their books and also, sending those around. And about 26,000 families, estimated about 1.5 million people, were benefiting from this program. Now, by 1943, the program begins to die out, and the program is terminated. And The reason for this was by 1943, we were in the war. And many of these women were able to find work now in factories doing war production. And of course, the young men were able to, find work, by being soldiers. So the WPA began to hire maybe some more women to do that and also go into the defense industries. So the need for the Packhorse librarians, traveling 18, 20-mile routes on the back of a horse in all kinds of weather, were getting to die out. But these women had become a really important part of that part of the country because they didn't just deliver books, they also would sometimes sit and read to the family. And this gave them an opportunity to get off the horse for a while. And it also gave them an opportunity to read to a family that may not have had, good readers or strong readers in their midst. And so sometimes what the women would do is they would say, okay, I'm going to read you, this first part of chapter 1, and then I'm going to leave you this book. And when I come back, you're going to hear it from me and, point out some words. Now, when I come back again in a couple of weeks, I want you to be able to read this to me. And so these women were really teachers. They were helping to spread literacy that way. And in return, sometimes they would be offered lunch or dinner, or if it was getting late and rather than get back out on the trail in the dark, they might be, invited to sleep on the sofa or sleep out in the barn overnight. Get a fresh start in the morning. We'll give you breakfast. You've been helping us out here. We want to help you out here a little bit too. So there was a real sense of community and a real sense of people helping folks out. So by 1943, no longer a need for this. The women could get jobs other places. And what happened was the program was discontinued. Many of the notes, much of the material was just done away with. Many of the books and things were then given as scrap drives and turned into, maps and training manuals and those sorts of things. But it was an important program because it gave women jobs, right, which gave them the opportunity for a little independence and a little bit of, that feeling of having a purpose, that feeling of having a need, not having to be dependent upon the man, in the family. It gave them a sense of that. It promoted literacy in an area where many of the schools had closed down because they couldn't pay the teachers anymore. The literacy that they were helping to raise made it easier for folks to find jobs because they could read job applications, they could read job postings and things. This was really important when the war came along, right? Because you had to train these people how to work machines and material and such. The reading levels had been raised by this. It also promoted a sense of community because these women had to work with other folks in the community. The federal government was only paying for the salaries. Everything else had to come from those women or from the people in the community helping them out. And the folks in the community did step up on that. And President Roosevelt felt that this was a really, really important program because you have to remember that at this time, 1936 to 1943, in many places in the world, especially Nazi Germany or any of the area that the Nazis were controlling, books were being not distributed, they were being burned, right? Hitler wanted you only to read what he wanted you to read. And so Roosevelt believed that, by getting these books out there, whether they're children's books or, instruction manuals or magazines or all these different things with articles and such, what this is doing is it's helping to promote democracy because it's giving these folks a wider worldview. And now they're going to be less likely to fall for the snake salesman. They're going to be less likely to fall for dictators and people like that because they've got perspective. They know how to weigh one idea off of another. So he felt it was a great way also to promote democracy. And it was another opportunity for, just as I'm sure you guys are doing there at McArthur, the little local libraries to reinvent themselves and provide service for the folks in the community yet once again. So if you couldn't get into the library, or if the library proper was closed, let's get some of those books. We'll get them on the trail. We'll get them out to people, and we'll continue to do the service that libraries, were intended and designed to do. All of this from one little public law as one little part of the WPA, famous for building bridges and roads and ports and airports and ballparks and all that sort of stuff. But most people don't know that there were these 1,000 women, and there was about 200 at work at any given time, but 1,000 women over the course of the program, 1935 to 1943, helping to promote literacy, helping to promote democracy, and helping to promote community, while they made just under $1 a day. So let's take a look and see what we got. We've got some questions in. Why were they not allowed to be married? What was their salary of $28 per month equal to in today? Oh, great questions. Generally speaking, they weren't allowed to be married because the jobs were supposed to go to women that needed. The idea was, if you were married, then your husband should be taking care of you. And so, and if your husband was there. Now, some of these guys left and went off on WPA projects and such. So the idea was that, you should have been depending on your man to take care of you. But if there's no man there for you to lean on, then you should have that job, because those are the women that are going to need the job more than women who have someone else to take care of them. This was very common, by the way, across industries at that time. If you were a school teacher during the 1930s, during the Great Depression, it was very often written into your contract that your employment was dependent upon you staying single. Because if you got married, then now you've got two incomes and the job would go to somebody else. So as long as you were needing the job, you could have it. But if you, joined up and got married, then the idea was your husband would be the one that would take care of you today. Now, let me see, what would that be worth in today's dollar? 28 bucks an hour, 28 bucks an hour. Hey, that'd be great. 28 bucks a month in 1935 would be worth about $540 a month today. Okay, so that's really good money, for back at that time in Appalachia. But again, it's not, they weren't getting rich doing this, and it was hard work. You're out there in the rain, you're out there in the sun, you're out there in the winter, you're out there with the rattlesnakes, you're out there with the bears, and let's not forget the ever-present danger of paper cuts. There you go. Let's see. How did librarians keep track of who had what on their routes and make sure it was returned? Well, that's where the monthly conferences come in handy, and the clerk that would keep that track of that. Because what the clerks back at the monthly conference would do is they would the Packhorse librarians would come back with requests. Oh, they want Treasure Island out on my route. Oh, okay, Treasure Island. Let's see. Oh, come to find out, oh, that's out on Route 7, and it won't be back again for another couple of weeks. And so it was up to the clerks back in the monthly conferences to keep track of where the books were, who was requesting the books, what routes they were on, and what condition they were in. Do they need to be pulled from the route? Can they go back out again without being repasted? Because that takes resources to be able to do that. And these you could keep the books as long as you wanted, as long as it was reasonable, right? You couldn't keep a book for a year, but if the Packhorse librarian came back around in a couple of weeks and you hadn't finished that book, and you said, oh, I'm just up to the part where they find the treasure, they would let you keep it another couple of weeks and such. It wasn't, the idea of the program was to get the material out, not to control it and keep it from getting to people and such. Let's see. Whoops. Are there any historic accounts from the recipients of these library books on the difference it made in their lives? Wow, that's a great question. That's a really good question. Not Not officially that I know of. I mean, certainly the fact that the program lasted as long as it did, and the fact that people responded to it the way that they did by lending the books, by doing the penny drives and such, shows that it was having an impact on folks. But there was no formal study or anything like that that I'm aware of. In fact, there's a lot. It's hard to find information about the Packhorse librarians because it was such a small little group, only 1,000 women spread out from 1935 to 1943. And the records were kept, in these monthly conferences. So, once the program's over, are you going to hang on to this? Probably not, right? The scrapbooks were turned into scrap paper and, repurposed for the war effort and such. Nobody thought to keep that stuff. Nobody thought to hang on to that stuff. So, that's what I like about it, because it's a cool little part of history that not a lot of people know about. Let's see, here's another one. How did you find the scrapbook and other artifacts? The scrapbook is actually a reproduction that was made based upon one that we have in our collection. And the other things are just things that we've found and put together over the course of time. Again, the records of these women are few and far between. So it was really hard to do this. And back in the like in the 1970s and 80s, there was a little bit of information, where some of these people have done like oral histories and stuff. That's primarily where you get the information, from the oral histories. And most of these women, of course, have passed on now. Now, this was a program that was primarily in southeastern Kentucky. It didn't really catch on in the rest of the country for a whole lot of reasons, but you did begin to see the next generation of this in the 1950s. After the war was over, bookmobiles became very popular. And the bookmobile was a car or a truck or a van that was loaded with books, and they would drive around in rural areas or cities and distribute books that way. So you can think of the bookmobiles, maybe you remember some of those when you were a kid, the bookmobiles coming around, and that was kind of like the next phase or the next generation of these Packhorse librarians. So was any particular book or author that were rediscovered because the Packhorse librarians, like it wasn't popular but became popular? That's another great question. The popular the books, it wasn't so much the authors, I think, that were popular, but it was books that had senses of adventure, books that could take you somewhere, take you away, Treasure Island, Robin Hood, Spy in Williamsburg, the kinds of books that we showed here. These were the kinds of things where you could kind of lose yourself in these books a little bit. This was as much for entertainment as it was for education. And that's what made it, I think, so successful, because if you can have fun while you're learning, that's what it's all about. That's what it's all about. So I don't know if there was any, authors that kind of, came back from the obscurity so much as it was, the stories themselves and those sorts of things. Anything else? If you guys, I don't know, if you guys want to unmute and ask questions in your real live voices, you could do that too. If that's okay with McArthur Library, because they're running the show.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely fine. There is one more question that just popped up in the chat.
Okay, let me take a look. Did they have regular routes and daily destinations where they and their horses would spend the night? And how often did they repeat their route? They did have regular routes, and they would not go out. They would go out every couple days. You wouldn't be out necessarily every single day, because you did have other things you had to do back at the farm and such. But you did have pretty well established routes, right? Because you knew the people on your route, and you knew what books they had, and you knew how to get there and how to get back and such. And the way it would work out is you would probably swing back on your route in about 3 weeks or so. So, you'd go out, I'd drop off the books in, McArthurville there, and then you wouldn't see me for about another 3 weeks or so. Now, I'm not just sitting home during that time. I may be out on another route in another part of the valley, but then I'll come back and I'll swing back and I'll see how you guys are doing with that route as well. And they did. They ended up, getting sort of their favorites. If there were children at like a particular farmhouse or a particular, place, you have the fun of reading to them, and the kids would look forward to, oh, here comes the Packhorse librarian, maybe she'll read to us again today. So the sense of community was really, really important in this as well, and that's why the local women were so important, because they knew the topography, they knew the area, and they knew the people. And if they didn't know the people directly, they got to know them. And your local Packhorse librarian was kind of like like your neighborhood friend, as they came through. So yes, they did have regular routes, and they would have like regular favorites that they would pop in for lunch or dinner, or occasionally stay over. Anybody else?
Don't be shy, everyone. If you have any more questions, please feel free to unmute and turn on your video and ask us questions. Okay, well, I guess that's it. I can't thank you enough, Jeff, for visiting with us tonight.
My pleasure.
Really enjoyed it.
I hope that was what you were looking for, and I hope folks had a good time. And as you said, the Book Women of Troublesome Creek and The Giver of Stars are two books that talk about they're actually other stories, but they spin around this idea of the book women. So if you're interested in learning more about them, you can read those books, and it'll give you a kind of a flavor. But now you know some of the history behind the whole thing.
Well, thank you so much. And I hope you can join us. I know before we were chatting a little bit about having you back maybe sometime to do some more information about FDR and Eleanor Roosevelt. That would be wonderful.
Sure. I'll send you a list. I've got about like probably 40 topics I can talk about. I don't want to dominate your time, and I don't want people to get sick of me, but if folks are interested, I would love to come back. And there's plenty of Roosevelt story. And I love these little pockets of stuff that, that most people don't know about, but now all of you do.
Yes. Well, it was really wonderful. Thank you so much for this great presentation. And we really loved having you here in Maine. Thanks, Jeff.
All right. Be good, everybody. Take care. And guess what? Have a happy Thanksgiving, everyone.
Yes. Happy Thanksgiving.
Okay. We'll see you. Bye-bye.